Good morning. This is Wes Kern. I'm glad to have everybody on. We are just a little before 11 o'clock here, and we're going to give it a minute or so to allow folks to get in. We've got several registered today, and so we'll jump back on here in just a minute or two. Good morning. It looks like the attendee sign in here is slowing down a little bit, so we'll go ahead and get started. I want to thank you all again for joining us today. This, at least at the moment, is our June webinar event, and so today we're going to be talking about what should communities be doing now. And I have with me today Dan Manning and Tom Stevenson. I'll go ahead and apologize. Eric Frederick, who was going to join us today, fully anticipated and got pulled away and was unable to join us at this time. But certainly we'll have him. We've got several of these scheduled out through the remainder of the year, and he'll be joining us multiple times throughout the schedule. But again, Dan and Tom, we're glad to have you all this morning. Dan and Tom both serve as broadband solutions managers across the state and have worked in many of our communities. We want to thank you all for joining us.
Good to be here, Wes. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure.
Dan and Tom, you all have been guests on this webinar series now a time or two, and so I'm going to jump right on into today's content. Try to cover as much ground today as we can, and certainly I think today's a great opportunity to do some Q&A. And so I'd ask all of our guests to utilize that Q&A function in the Zoom webinar tools. To please go ahead and start asking questions that you're interested in related to how what communities could be doing right now. We're going to hit on a few things, but certainly want to try to leave as much room at the end as we can to answer any questions that anyone might have. And so, gentlemen, to get started off today in prep of this discussion, there are three areas that I think we should probably discuss, and one of those is local leadership. And Dan, you and I even talked about local leadership or the development of local leadership a while back now. Relationships, and then near-term efforts. Those seem like three really pertinent things for us to discuss today. And so with that, I want to go ahead and give you guys an opportunity to I guess, kind of maybe highlight those things, and then we'll dig a little deeper on individual pieces. And I think, the first thing being that leadership piece.
And I'll be happy to go first on that one. I think that, as we talked about on one of the prior webinars, but we're seeing this consistently across the board in all the communities that both Tom and I are working with, is that the need for leadership within a community, whether that's a township or a village or a county, somebody that's got some responsibility, or at least some tag with broadband on them as a point of contact within that community, becomes really important, especially in a time like now when we've got so much activity going on, lots of investments coming our way and all that. Which is one of the reasons that as Tom and I have been working with counties across the state, we come in and tend to form these broadband committees, which we have in a lot of places. But even if a full committee doesn't make sense, just having someone with that broadband banner on them as a point of contact becomes really important, not just for being a focal point for all broadband related activities going on there, but also to give a contact point for the broadband providers that could be, the source of a lot of solutions of what you're looking for. Tom and I were just in a meeting yesterday with a provider, and that was one of his key questions is that he's looking to do some additional build out in a few different counties, but he didn't know who to contact in each of those counties because that broadband focal point really hadn't been identified. So, and I know it's difficult to do that in the light of resource constraints and a lot of people doing this as a part-time job, but just being able to identify somebody or some small committee that can kind of carry that broadband banner within a community, I think becomes really important.
Yeah, I have to totally agree with that. What we're seeing is that, working through these with all the different communities, we kind of established these single point of contacts, what we like to call. And I'm finding out that, and we're seeing this as the counties receiving all this ARPA money and all this other funding coming in right now. They're leaning heavily on those single points of contact because broadband is such a hot topic, and a lot of that money can be put towards broadband. So having that person having relationships with the providers to start those conversations and also help guide these committees or executive or strategic planning committees that a lot of counties are forming is really important.
Yeah, and I think one of the key pieces to that conversation is obviously this idea of having, some authority, right? That ability to drive some conversation, to drive some of those relationships, and ultimately to be able to make sure that things are happening at the local level too. So that single point of contact, Dan, I think that you mentioned that initially, it's being somebody that is representative of the community. So from these teams, this is kind of that consolidated person or individual who has, whether it's the backing of your county or the township, or collectively within the community. And we'll use community loosely, right? Sometimes that's a region, a subsector of the county or a county, and so having some authority there, or the backing of the officials to make and represent the full interests of that community are really important, as far as being able to be effective and efficient in those kinds of conversations, relationships, and ultimately the development within the community.
Wes, if I could, just one last comment to kind of tie that up to is that in a lot of my recent conversations, I'm starting to see more and more counties and other communities starting to buy into a lot of that stuff and the need for leadership, to the point where some of them are considering even hiring somebody to take that role as a broadband coordinator or director of broadband, whatever you might want to call them, but just somebody to be that focal point, because everybody else, like I said, was kind of doing this as a part-time thing, and nobody ends up with enough focus on it to really do it justice. So they're either looking at hiring somebody or contracting with an outside person, or maybe even hiring a consultant to kind of play that role for them, at least on a part-time basis.
Yeah, and there was a question that says, good point, does this person, POC, need to be an elected or appointed person versus a volunteer champion? Would either one of y'all want to speak to that?
A lot of times, a lot of communities are looking at not an elected official, although some elected officials can work that duty, but basically looking to hire somebody within their community that has expertise, or an outside consulting firm. So I know a lot of the outside consulting firms right now are booked up, so that's pretty hard to find. So a lot of people are thinking about that already and already doing the hiring. Like Dan says, they're looking around, and a lot of those guys are already tied up. So yes, it's a good idea. And you could share those resources too. Some of my townships are looking at forming their own strategic planning committees, and so is a county. So it might help to have one person, all these different entities running off in different directions, maybe consolidating a little bit and hiring one single person to address these issues if possible.
Yeah, and I think there's merit to all of those options. Being somebody who's, and we don't see an elected official most of the time, or someone who's elected, but certainly seeing some appointed folks or hired by local government. But again, there are merits to both the local government side of it, or a regional committee, or someone who's a volunteer champion. Although I think the hardest thing for a volunteer champion is just going to be ensuring that they have the backing of the community, and those who do have the authority to make decisions really being behind them, to be able to help guide those conversations, and be that strong representative for the community. There was a question, and I tell you, what we'll do is questions that are kind of lined up with the topic that we're discussing. We'll hit those as we're going through here. I do have a question about mapping, and so we'll touch on that when we get into the Q&A portion here in just a few minutes. Let's jump over and talk about relationships. Again, I think leadership, this idea of leadership is the groundwork going into the relationship conversation. But the idea that right now communities can be developing relationships. Dan and Tom, both you all are engaged in that process on a daily basis. I sit in on meetings and hear about the activities that are happening. How important is it for for communities in general to be developing relationships with providers amongst themselves? What types of relationships and how important are they?
I think this is an ideal time again for building these relationships if you don't already have them, and they really ought to be with your broadband providers, those that are serving your communities. And if you don't know who those folks are, Tom and I can provide you with that information from a lot of the research and mapping work that we do. But right now, with a lot of investment coming down the road here from various sources, the providers are really motivated to kind of sort through that themselves and figure out where that they can be most effective and do the most good, if you will. And if you've got good relationships with those providers, between the two of you working together, it becomes a lot easier to identify the areas within your community that really truly do need the help, and where you can prioritize where some of these build outs and future projects ought to be. So if you don't know your providers now, you ought to go out there and make that effort to at least have an introductory meeting with them, understand what their current footprint looks like and what their plans are going forward. And then it makes it a lot easier going down the road to look at future projects. And you should also understand too, the relationships kind of at a higher level, understand what your support structure is. So you got folks like Tom and I that can help you on a more general basis. There's also support at the state now through this Connecting Michigan task force that's been put in place to help escalate major issues and also help drive the strategy for broadband across the state. So there are other people out there behind you that can help with depending on what the issues are in your particular community.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. It's important to start developing those relationships, and we're seeing those teams that have successfully, those individuals or groups that have been working on this broadband for a while. And we've got some communities I've been working with since 2011. So they're well established. And so now they're actually talking to the providers. They're looking at the guidelines, trying to follow the guidelines that are given, how they can spend the money. And so are the providers. And I've even seen a few of these communities and the providers enter into NDAs and get into some serious conversations. So they're about the build outs and what can be done. So, and also, with the funding coming out that we have right now, it's important to know who is your provider, what commitments are already in your community, and how can that be used. So it's very important.
Yeah, so we've got a couple of questions coming in here. One specific to the Big Rapids community, across the county, and so sorry, Tom.
No, that's me. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So this idea that providers have not been interested in these conversations, particularly in the past, and certainly you in the past we've probably had a lot of providers that maybe may not have been all that interested in these conversations. I think the big difference, and Dan and Tom, I think you would agree right now, is that we have funding we're at funding levels and discussions about funding that I don't know that any of us would have ever dreamed about for rural broadband deployment or just broadband deployment in general. And that has absolutely started a conversation with just about every provider I've run into as they're really looking at areas that they would have never considered because the funding is just such a dynamic that we haven't had in the past. When we look at the federal dollars that are being made available, the potential for infrastructure dollars, you consider some of the funding that's coming through the state, some of the federal dollars that the state will have and could potentially use for broadband. There's just such a plethora of funding, which has always kind of been the big roadblock to build out. That I think we're seeing a lot of providers who are looking at areas or are willing to discuss areas because the business model has changed because of this funding. And so I think it's certainly worth, if you've had conversations or have tried to have conversations, building new conversations up and starting to build new relationships with providers that maybe you haven't talked with in the past, even in the past 6 months, because much of this has changed in just that amount of time. I think it's really important to kind of go back and start having those conversations again and looking at what might be possible with the providers that are local. And one of the things that we often talk about is that the provider who's already in your community is going to be the first provider who can help, at least as far as the easiest. That doesn't mean that they'll end up being the final solution. Doesn't mean they'll be the only solution. But usually they're going to be the one who can do it the easiest. And so, making sure that you're building those relationships, maintaining relationships with those providers is obviously very important. As we look at that question, are there individual people, Tom, I think the question even would be to you, is there someone in Mecosta County that they should be talking with? And I think that's something that maybe you can follow up with, post this meeting again. Looking through the questions here, because they look like they're related. Go ahead, Tom.
Wes, can I add to that? One of the
Sure.
other things that providers are looking at, and again, we were with a provider yesterday, is that, COVID, the demand on the internet's increased 30 to 40%. And so in the past, in the rural areas, the adoption rate hasn't been always the strongest too. So between the lack of density of the population and then also the lack of adoption or the perception of use. So we've seen it's a double-edged sword. There's more funding, but also the providers are noticing a much higher adoption rate too. And so now developing that return on investment, ROI, as we call, it becomes much more possible and much more attractive than what it has in the past. Basically, we went from 2020 to 2030 in terms of technology overnight, and they're trying to respond to it when possible. So.
Anyway, we've kind of talked around this a little bit, but this whole idea of the American Rescue funds that becoming available, the American Rescue Plan, and those dollars that are coming down to the townships and the counties becoming available, that's kind of motivating a lot of these providers as well to maybe entertain working in some areas that they really hadn't really considered before because they couldn't make money on their own. So they're much more motivated to sit down and talk with municipalities about working together and maybe sharing in some of those funds, and that giving them enough money so that they can expand just a little bit outside of their current footprint. Because I know Tom and I get lots of calls from folks that say that I'm a mile and a half from my Comcast connection, neighbor down the street can get it and I can't. And how do we fix that? Well, we may be at a point right now, maybe through the use of some of these ARP funds, that Comcast and Charters and other cable companies and other providers are willing to stretch that a little bit and extend their network just enough to pick up a lot of those people that are making those phone calls.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Dan. There's again, it's just the amount of funding that's out there is just the numbers are we're talking billions upon billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, and those just aren't numbers. I don't think I've yet to meet anybody who would have speculated that we'd have this kind of funding to discuss. And certainly the flip side of that is that it removes funding from it begins to remove funding, let's say that, from the equation of concern. But the other side of that is now we're talking about shortages in workforce. force and other resources, network equipment and fiber and so on and so forth that are just core technologies to expanding your networks that are going to be, unfortunately, maybe some of the barriers that we're dealing with now for the next several months and years for sure.
Mhm.
Looking down through here, there's a good question here. Just a note that this is from Michael McCullough. We've put together a broadband task force and we have administrative support. Just hoping that we would maybe discuss how to orient the task force's work, and to develop its strategic imperatives. So, as we think about this, it's important to have this leadership. Certainly, having a group within the community who represents the community, such as a task force, is important. Dan, or any thoughts on this question that I think popped up in the chat actually?
Right. I had one Saturday, actually. I had a team on Saturday call, had a long conversation about developing the strategic team. And it's important to look at all the needs of the community. And I gave one example. I even had a meeting about a library meeting I went to, and they're getting funding too. So they wanted to redo their devices. They're looking at broadband, running cabling throughout the library and getting rid of all the Wi-Fi systems itself. And we're expanding and upgrading a lot of the system. So the point being is, the first thing to do, and a lot of my communities are doing this, is develop that strategic plan and actually sit down and look at what the needs are, but also look at some of these organizations that make sure that they're tapping into those separate funds too. And I think that's an important first step right there. And they are waiting for the guidelines. I know some of our guidelines are pretty fuzzy right now on how this is going to be used. And so a lot of my communities are saying we're not going to spend $1 until January 1st until we get those guidelines settled, and maybe a couple of them will be contended in court. And we're going to wait till everything's settled out, because the last thing they want to do is give that money back. So get caught up in an audit. So yeah, I think it's really important to sit down and develop those strategic plans and those needs.
Let's move on a little bit, and again, there's several questions here that are they're all kind of related. I think we'll pick up here after we get through these topics. Let's talk about near-term opportunities, things that need to be done or can be done. The first of that, one of the first things that comes to mind to me is making sure that a community is aware of the emergency broadband benefit where it applies and it makes sense. But certainly, being aware of some of the funds that are out there, how they may or may not be utilized in the community. All of those seem like things that communities can and should be doing right now. Could you all speak to that a little bit?
Well, obviously, there's lots of sources of funding that are coming down the road here. One of the bigger programs, and keep me on point here, Wes, but one of the bigger programs is this Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, big federal program, $20 billion, going to be doing build outs here across the state and across the country over the next 6 years. So there's been about, I think it was $363 million that'll be coming to the state of Michigan as subsidies to help providers build out in certain areas across the state. So it's important to know where that build out's going to be taking place and if it's going to be affecting your communities. So for a couple of reasons. Number one, so you know that that's coming and you can kind of plan for it, assuming that's all going to take place as planned. But also so you can start to get to know who some of those providers are and do what we can in order to maybe ease that implementation, if you will, maybe even accelerate it in some cases to make that happen faster. But that's going to be build outs of 100 meg minimum service, and in most cases, gigabit level service to those areas across the state where these providers have committed to that. So you got programs like that. There are other big funding programs like the USDA has with their Reconnect program for rural broadband build out. We've got the state level CMIC grants, which are Connecting Michigan Community Grants, smaller in nature, but more focused on specific things within your own community where local providers can take advantage of that where there are unserved areas. So a lot of funding sources out there. I think that at least answers part of your question there, Wes, if I got it all.
The other one I want to step into is that just before the art off, we had several of our Michigan electric co-ops, rural co-ops, decided to build out broadband to all their customers and develop a 21st century electrical infrastructure. So between RDOF and the hundreds of millions of dollars that the rural electric co-ops are spending right now and commitments over the next 4 or 5 years, I think it's important to have these meetings with the community and with these providers as well as the electric co-ops and then their teams to look at what the build outs are, how it's scheduled, and actually how can I help? How can I speed that up? And maybe look at how some of this funding you can come together and work with them to help speed things up and help alleviate that to move things forward.
Yeah, and there was a question that came in that asks if you need a grant writer to apply for funds, and I think the hard and fast answer is no. I think the responsible answer to that though is it would certainly be advantageous, and it's good, and that question kind of leads me to this to what can communities be doing, and I think assessing internally and within the community what resources you have to take advantage of these opportunities is important. So this idea of finding or identifying maybe a single point of contact is important, but what other resources may you need to have in your community to be able to respond? And I do think someone who has grant writing experience would be advantageous for a community. Our experience in helping communities and working through, and even my personal experience of working through some of the federal grants in the past, is having folks who have that experience on board can help streamline it, make it a lot easier as you go through trying to put together all of the requirements for those grants, simply because they have that experience and they have an eye for typically for what is being requested and what that needs to look like, how to format just the simple things. Having those people or having those resources available can be important. Any additional thoughts on that, Dan or Tom?
Yeah, I would add a little bit on regarding grant writers, is that one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of these funding sources that we've been talking about so far, most of them, the applicants for those grants are the broadband providers themselves who are working in conjunction with the community. So typically it's the broadband providers that are having to respond to the grants and put together the applications. They're the ones that really need the grant writers. At the same time, it's helpful for somebody within a community to have somebody with those kind of skills and understandings as well, so you know what's going into the grants. Some of these programs, I think like the NTIA grant that just came out that we haven't even talked about yet, is another one where a community can apply on their own for it. So in that particular case anyway, a grant writer would be helpful to have. But again, it comes back to the point that Tom was making, is that you got to be careful about what grants you're applying for and what particular areas within your community that you're directing those funds toward, because there's lots of build out already taking place or coming down the road, and you need to know what those are so that you're not building in a place that's going to get overbuilt in the next few years.
Well, the other thing too is if there's I think one of the stipulations I saw in the ARP is that, if an area is deemed to be built out before, what's it, 2024, December 31st, that's ineligible for that funding. So you got to be careful you don't start writing grants and spend the time and effort to write a grant for an area that's already going to be built out, that's already planned, because that could be challenged. And then you're just kind of spinning your wheels there. So.
Any other, before we go kind of dive into some additional Q&A pieces, anything else on just, things that communities should be doing, right now in this very near term, very specifically?
Yes. I think our Michigan Treasury Department came out with a good set of guidelines here, real simple set of guidelines about take your time, sit down, form your strategic planning committee, and talk to your leaders, talk to your providers, gather as much information as you can on what your needs are and what the plans are for your community. And then bring in those providers, and typically on a one-on-one basis. It's hard for them to talk privately when they've got their competitors sitting in the room. You got to keep that in mind, and because they are business. And so I think that's some of the simple tasks. And like I said, some of my community leaders now decided just for the sake of making sure they get this right, is they're taking their time and they're not going to spend money until January 1st. I've heard that several times already. That seems to be rolling through the county commissioners and things. They're kind of all spreading the word about that. So
Yeah, I guess the other thought that I would have too, in terms of, what can you be doing right now in order to be successful down the road is, and I know a lot of the communities I'm working with are struggling with this right now, is to understand more precisely where the need is within your community, whether it's a township or a county, where is that specific need where those areas are underserved, meaning that they're getting less than 25 meg service today, or they're not served at all. And knowing at least where that demand is, what the population looks like in those areas. You don't want to go out and design some big solution you're going to go after and only fix 5 households, for example. Those 5 are important, but you got to keep it in line with what the investment's going to be. So getting a good handle on where the need is and where the most bang for the buck can be is really important. And you can do that to some degree using some of the maps, though I think we all understand the maps aren't as accurate as we'd like them to be. But getting other data through surveys or other feedback from your residents about what they're actually seeing on the ground in their homes in terms of service levels is important to have that, so you can build the case as to why you're going to go out and make some investment in particular areas.
yeah, one of the things I've had communities talk to me about is how they can help the providers, but also one way of helping also is to help anchor some of these bills and be a good customer. I'm seeing a lot of my northern communities are looking at putting in real strong Wi-Fi systems in their campgrounds. And they're thinking this is going to go, something that's transformational, and upgrading their equipment at their township hall so that when the fiber comes through, they can actually use it. So their old aging equipment, communication equipment, doesn't become a chokehold. So yeah, not only help the providers with the build outs, but also looking at also possibly being a good customer and to bring economic wealth and diversity to your community. This is the one-shot deal. This is an excellent opportunity to be looking at things like that. So.
Yeah, so we'll go ahead and move into some Q&A. We've obviously been answering a lot of questions that have popped up. There's a whole plethora of questions that popped up to kind of related to mapping, and Dan, you talked about that just a moment ago, and where good sources and so on and so forth. And so certainly Connected Nation Michigan has been in the process of updating even the maps that we work on. And admittedly, there are limitations even to that data. Simply, Connected Nation Michigan works directly with providers in the state to gather information about where their services are. In instances where we're unable to either receive that data or unable to get it from a provider, we have to lean against the FCC's 477 data set, which is in and of itself. And there's a few webinar, you go back a few webinar episodes ago, and we've talked about that many times. But certainly there are some issues with the 477 data as it stands today. That entire process is currently under the microscope of how do we change that? What do we do to update and get better data? And so we expect a new data collection under the FCC's 477 sooner rather than later with all new set of rules. There are RFPs that have recently gone out that will be a part of that process. Those RFPs are looking for new data sets that are really designed and driven towards a higher level of accuracy in the data that the FCC represents, and for that matter, what the providers are providing to the FCC. It's anticipated that there will be some new mechanisms for challenging the data at the FCC at the federal level. Certainly, through the various different grant programs, they use different mechanisms for challenging the data that's out there or submissions by providers. So there's at the moment, there's just kind of this smattering of different processes that are taking place, all of which seem to be kind of driving towards new processes that the FCC's got in place or is working to put in place. as well as this new data set. So, the new, I guess 30,000 foot view of what FCC data should look like in the future is this idea of, almost rooftop household type responses of where service is available and where it is not. Certainly that doesn't help us answer the questions that we have today necessarily. But certainly that's where we're headed. As we talked about RDOF, I think there's a second round of RDOF funding that will come out of, or that we'll see most likely not until the new funding is out, or the new mapping is out, or at least that's I think most people's hope is that we'll have new mapping before some of those new funds from that come out. But certainly within a community, I think it's important to, and this is where having these conversations about relationships and whatnot with your providers, as you understand areas to not be served, having built relationships with these providers gives you that opportunity to ask questions about what needs to happen. Why does the map show this, but it doesn't? And what can we do to verify these areas where, as a provider, you have submitted data, and oftentimes submitted data exactly as they are required to by the federal government, but it'll create an overstatement, or in some instances, it's an understatement. And so, as you build those relationships and you're looking at those areas, you get to have those conversations with the provider that says, I understand the requirements for submitting data. I understand that leaves areas showing as having service that don't have service, and what do we need to do to rectify that? How can we as a community help bring funds to this, help clean this up, whatever it may be. I think that's where having those relationships really begins to have, is one of the areas where having those relationships and that leadership locally can be very beneficial as we look to expand these services. Dan or Tom, would y'all add to that if there's things that you would?
Oh, I think
you went through a lot of stuff there, Wes, which I think is great.
Yeah.
Sorry.
We could expand on lots of things here if you'd like. I'm looking through the remaining questions here, see if there's others that we haven't answered. There was one I noticed here about build out plans from various ISPs, and if there's something more than what RDOF is getting, because we know what the RDOF plans are. And the comment was made that build plans are typically proprietary by providers, and that's true. So it's difficult to know exactly what each individual ISP is doing in terms of their future plans for build out. But that's, again, back to the point you just made, Wes, about those relationships having locally with your ISPs and understanding what they're currently doing. And that can open up some opportunities to ask those questions to find out what they're planning to do, at least within your community or nearby, that they'd be willing to share with you if you get to know them well enough, and they have some trust with what you want to do with them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's a good question here that talks about this idea of once service hits the building. Okay, so Dennis, you asked the question about, is there any part of the CMIC or ARP money that could be used for rewiring, essentially of buildings and whatnot. And I think part of that's going to come down to the point of demarcation, if you will, for providers, where they're going to stop, where their equipment's going to stop. Oftentimes, and we hear this a lot. Tom, you talk about this pretty often, where you could have fiber attached to the side of your home, but unfortunately, if you're using a router that's 5 years old, a Wi-Fi router and you've connected to that, you could have gig service, but you're only seeing 150 meg down because your router is out of, the technology itself is old. And so we see this already a lot. That's what we see, and oftentimes one of the good solutions for that is bringing as much education to the community as possible about what they're using, why they're seeing issues, and providers, I think, would love that, and to have their communities talking through this and educating the residents and businesses in the community that we all as consumers of the technology have a responsibility to keep up with our technology as well, and try to keep up with what's coming down the pipe. And so I think there's a lot of different solutions there. Where that point of demarcation is certainly a question on, as the provider is building out the type of technology and electronics they offer, A lot of providers offer electronics that are leased or rented on a monthly basis, essentially. That kind of helps with a lot of that. But certainly, there's an education on that needs to take place. And certainly as communities, look at how these funds can be used from an infrastructure standpoint, we don't have all those answers at this point. What's going to be viable from a grant perspective. And so I think there's a lot that we're going to learn in the near term. We're going to see a lot of interesting and unique deployments, I think, through this process. And it's a long conversation for a non-answer, but certainly something that I think there's multiple facets to seeing a solution there.
And I think just to add about the specific question about rewiring and help with, inside the building kinds of stuff. I think, Tom, wasn't there a community down in Texas that did a little video about what you can do within your own home in order to check your router and connectivity and so on?
Actually, Wes helped put that together, I believe, the video down in our city of Prosper. That's one of them. And we've got a few communities looking at, even our local libraries now are doing these little spot videos on how to do this and how to do that. And using some of the funds, the quick 3-minute video of how to use certain technologies and walk people through on YouTube. So yeah, that's something we're looking at. And also, like I said, some of the townships we have, that are going to be seeing when they have like a satellite connection or an old DSL connection, now they're getting fiber. So quickly they're going to have to upgrade their equipment. We had that over in, I believe, Oscoda Township. They did that. They rewired everything they had to, so that now they can run video cameras and take full advantage of gig service now at their township hall and their other village buildings. So yeah, that's critical. And that's something to be thought out. And that's where you work with your local IT person, you get them involved in the conversation. If we go this way, what do we need to do? And it's more than just installing it in the building. So yes.
Yeah, and I think something too that's important to remember in all of this is that we're not going to see a one-size-fits-all solution to closing the digital divide. Even from a technology standpoint, there was a question that popped up a little bit ago about technologies, and it's even with all the funding that we have, when we take into account the necessity to reach that one house that's 5 miles away from everything else. What's fiscally responsible, what's fiscally feasible, and what technologies can we find that will meet the needs to provide an equitable broadband connection. I think those are things that we need to keep in mind as we go through all of this, is that we're just going to have a lot of different solutions. I also want to make note too. I think there may have been some questions, or someone had raised their hand. If you please submit any questions, we've still got 2 or 3 minutes here. Please submit any of your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to touch those before we get away, or we'll follow up after the webinar. There's a question here, Tom. I know you're more familiar with it than I am, but there's a question about sending a link to the Michigan Treasury Bulletin that you mentioned earlier. Is that something that you can help with?
That was a webinar that was put out. I can send the quick link. There's just a quick talking points from the PowerPoint that Rod Taylor from the Treasury Department put out, and just to advise the communities. And normally that was put on by the Council of Governments. Several of the Council of Governments put those on for all the members in the community. So yeah, I can send me that link, send me the information or your email address, and I can send you the quick nine quick steps. Real simple, quick communication. So yes, I can do that.
Thank you. All right. I think there's a couple of questions, just very specific community type questions that probably make most sense for us to follow up with shortly or after the webinar. If there's not anything else, I think we've generally covered most of these, but certainly, feel free to reach out to Dan or Tom or myself. We'll all be happy to help answer questions. Dan and Tom basically split the state in half, north to south, and so they'll be happy to reach out to you and work with your community where they can. I'm always happy to try to help answer and facilitate where I can as well. But with that, I think we'll go ahead and close. We will send a link out to this webinar. Should be within the next 2 or 3 days here. Once it's been loaded to YouTube, and it'll be available for review. And always feel free to go back and watch the other webinars. We referenced a few of them today. They're available from our there's a website on the Connected Nation Michigan website where you can view all of the previous episodes of this webinar, and we'll certainly send out a link with registration information for the next webinar. Dan or Tom, anything else before we head off today?
No, I'm good. I see a number of my community champions that were on the call today and some of the providers. So I know I'll be having conversations with them here shortly. So yes.
Same
Sounds
here.
good.
Great to talk
All
to
right.
you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thanks.